My name's Trevor Farrell, the Associate Dean here at Osgoode Hall Law School. Delighted to open up the proceedings at this year's Orr Emmett Lecture, and delighted to welcome Cheney Ryan here, who's going to be introduced in a moment by my colleague Francois Tanguay-Renaud. I'm also with my colleague Nicole Aylwin, who's here, director of the Winkler Institute, and we're delighted to support the Nathanson Center in sponsoring this year's event, and with Francois and Liel Gonzalez, who is working hard to get the food here, delighted that this is all coming off relatively smoothly. My job is just for a moment to let you know what is the Orr Emmett Lecture, and then Francois is going to introduce our speaker more properly. The Orr Emmett Fund was established in 1976 to promote the study of law in the broadest sense, and really the idea is through public debate, engagement, scholarly writing, and professional dialogue to think seriously about the idea of law generally defined. The words Orr Emmett really mean light of truth, and I think the idea is to explore different ideas in many different contexts. The nice thing about the connection with the Nathanson Center when it generously partnered up with the Orr Emmett Fund to keep it alive and going is that the mandate of the lecture, I think, expanded even still to include various topics within the ballpark of the Nathanson Center, which has been really exciting and has brought us, I think, to why you're here today. So delighted to carry on the tradition and have the lecture here again this year. And Francois, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our visitor.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And I'm equally pleased to be partnering with the Winkler Institute on Dispute Resolution to host this year's lecture. So good afternoon. My name is Francois Tanguay-Renaud. I'm the director here at Osgoode of the Jack and May Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security. And today it's really my pleasure to be introducing a great figure in the world of conflict resolution generally, as well as war and peace ethics in particular, Professor Cheney Ryan. I only met Professor Ryan 2 years ago at the launch of the Stockholm Center for the Ethics of War and Peace, where he was one of the keynote presenters. But there I finally met somebody whose literature I'd been familiar with for quite some years, and was really pleased to meet in person. It's like one of these moments where I was like, oh, you are Cheney Ryan, and here I am. So nice meeting you. So it's a real delight to have him with us today as our 2016 Orr Emmett Lecturer. Just to tell you a bit about him, Professor Ryan is a senior fellow and director of human rights programs for the program in ethics, law, and armed conflict at the University of Oxford. He's also co-chair of the Oxford Human Rights Consortium and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Professor Ryan also taught for many years at, and still does in fact, at the University of Oregon Law School, where he co-founded its graduate program on conflict resolution. Professor Ryan did part of his undergraduate studies today, I found out, at Harvard College, and also has a master's and a PhD degree from I think it is Boston University. And he was also a visiting fellow at the Harvard Law School at the beginning of the 1980s. Now, Professor Ryan came to study conflict resolution as well as the ethics of war and peace from a background in political activism. He came to commit to pacifism as a school of thought, working with Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement in the 1960s in the United States. He was involved with the anti-war movement in the late 1960s as well as early 1970s. And he was even expelled. You notice my little quip about Harvard. He was even expelled from college for his political protests. A badge of honor, which I think he still wears proudly today. He later became involved in migrant labor issues, working with the United Farm Workers Union on anti-pesticide activism. And since then, he is focused on issues of international conflict. He's been named by the Washington Post as one of the United States' 20 leading scholars on the frontier of peace and conflict studies, and he's received numerous human rights awards, including the Humanitarian of the Year award from the Jewish Federation and the Annual Human Rights Award from the Oregon Human Rights Coalition. He's also received the Joseph Blau Prize awarded by the Society for Advancement of American Philosophy for the most significant contribution to history of American philosophy in 2003. Indeed, an award was established in honor of his name, right? The Cheney Ryan Award by the University of Oregon Graduate Program in Conflict Resolution. Professor Ryan's latest book, The Chicken Hawk Syndrome, War, Sacrifice, and Personal Responsibility, was published in I think 2009 by Rowman and Littlefield, and he's also written numerous articles in leading law reviews as well as philosophy journals, encyclopedic entries, book reviews, as well as current affair opinion pieces. Today, as his 2016 Oramit lecture, he'll speak to us about pragmatism and vision in conflict resolution and peacemaking. Without further ado, I ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Cheney Ryan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Francoise, and also Liel, for making this a wonderful visit, and thank you all for coming out today. Let me just begin by explaining my title, and it will give you a structure of what I'm going to be doing. I was involved in starting a conflict resolution program at the University of Oregon, and I still teach there one course a year, the philosophical foundations of conflict resolution. So part of what I'm going to do is talk about conflict resolution. Most of my time, though, is spent at Oxford University in a program that specializes really in just war theory. I think the way to think about it is that I was hired to be their token pacifist and to raise questions about just war theory. So I'll raise some of those questions in the second part of this lecture. The theme which will unite them is the theme of pragmatism and vision. I'll draw this distinction. I'll relate it first to conflict resolution and then explain how it, I think, relates to the arguments between just war theory and pacifism. And let me say the first half of the lecture really ends with questions more than conclusions. The second half does argue for certain things about pacifism, which is generally not a position that people are that familiar with. And so I always try to sort of, among other things, talk about it and then discuss it and any questions people might have about it. Okay. But as I said, I'm going to begin the first part. We'll end with just a sort of a question, and we'd love to hear your answers to it. Now that I live a good part of every year in the United Kingdom, I've gotten to be much more sensitive than I was about how parochial my views are to the United States. United Kingdom is not a whole lot different from the United States in most ways, but still you're really impressed, as I was first time I've lived outside the United States, with the differences between cultures. I'm saying that because I'm talking to a Canadian audience, or at least an audience in Canada, and I hope it doesn't come across as too American-centric. One thing I will do, though, is talk about Martin Luther King. Both parts of what I'll talk about will relate to Martin Luther King. That's partly because I think that many of the arguments about politics in the United States, particularly progressive politics, in some sense can be reframed as, how do you view Martin Luther King? Sure, this is true with other cultures. It's certainly true with India and Gandhi. There's other examples of this. So I'll mention King. I'm not sure how much people really know about him. So I'll be happy to talk about that, and I'll give you some details on that as well. Let me begin then with conflict resolution. The conflict resolution program I'm involved with is a graduate level program housed in a law school, but not exclusively a law program. It includes law students as well as students from other disciplines, mainly the liberal arts, and its faculty divides equally between law and other fields. I am actually the only faculty member in this program who has both a law degree and a PhD, and so I have a unique position to encounter some of the disagreements that arise. The principal disagreement that I've run into in conflict resolution involves two basic orientations to the field, or two different styles. I will call them pragmatic and visionary. Their contrast first struck me as a way to capture the different mindsets of my students and colleagues, and I eventually have come to organize my introductory course in conflict resolution around this distinction. Now let me say right away, when I use the term pragmatism, just rely on how I'm defining it. It relates to what philosophers call classical American pragmatism, but I mean a much, much more expansive thing than that. So it will include also people like Rawls and people that you wouldn't normally think of, oh, they're a pragmatist. So I'm having a much more expansive notion of what that means. I'll be happy if anyone wants to talk about how it relates to people like Dewey or James, but I'm using the term as a term of art just to characterize a style. I typically concluded the course, still do to some extent, with a ringing call for reconciling the two views, reconciling vision and pragmatism. It seems to me that a field of conflict resolution should at least find a way to resolve its own conflicts. But as time has passed, I've become increasingly impressed, and not a little depressed, at the difficulties of reconciling these two, of reconciling pragmatism and vision. So let me first say what these two viewpoints are. The pragmatic approach, as I understand it, regards conflict resolution as a set of tools, useful for everyday problems and appropriate in some circumstances and not others. Conflict resolution thus conceived as a kind of trade. Learning about it makes you a practitioner, and being a good practitioner means understanding what the tools are and how to use them. The pragmatic approach sees mediation and negotiation as the core of conflict resolution, and is most comfortable dealing with manageable bite-sized problems and with parties with straightforward concerns. Some scholars, an example would be Carrie Mankell Meadow, who's written a lot on the history of conflict resolution. Some scholars identify the pragmatic approach with the whole field of conflict resolution. This approach, I found, is most congenial to law students and those from other professions like business. One reason, I think, is that it's easily teachable by the so-called case method predominant in American law schools and in schools often in the common law tradition. For example, one source of conflict resolution in the United States is family law. Issues around divorce, for example, where there are children involved. The presence of vulnerable third parties, the difficult emotions involved, the relationships that will continue whatever the resolution, these are ill-addressed, the feeling is, by battling it out in court. So discussion would proceed by presenting such a case and then asking how would an alternative way of resolving conflict address it. Okay, so it's very easily teachable cases, and I'll mention a particularly contentious case that always comes up in my class. For the pragmatic approach, I argue that the central virtue is reasonableness. I call it a virtue to suggest it's not just a way of thinking, but a type of character or character orientation. If you are a mediator, reasonableness means first the ability to see both sides of a question, both parties' points of view, with the aim of promoting reasonableness among the contending parties, that is, the ability to see the other person's point of view. Not just seeing it, but appreciating it. The reasonable person is responsive to the reasons of others, ready to temper their own reasoning accordingly, on the grounds that mutual respect means an aspiration to mutual agreement. Championing reasonableness is, as I see it, the aim of classic texts like Fisher and Urey's Getting to Yes. That's the most kind of common text in conflict resolution. It's called Getting to Yes, and as I read it, it's all about how do you promote reasonableness among people. The principal adversary of this approach is the adversarial approach, as it was known and taught when I was in law school. When I was in law school, you attended to the other person's reasons solely to defeat them, to promote your own position. You really weren't interested in reaching agreement. You looked at the other point of view solely to figure out how to make your own point of view prevail. So conflict resolution and ADR, in some senses, promoting reasonableness against that. This puts things crudely, of course, but I'm characterizing a style. The visionary approach. The visionary approach sees conflict resolution as an instrument of social change. Its principal hero in the United States is Martin Luther King Jr., whose civil rights movement is seen as an inspired exercise in the politics of reconciliation, but reconciliation grounded on a larger vision of justice. The pragmatic style is deeply attentive to the context of problems and the methods appropriate to those contexts. The visionary style aims to change the context and conceive itself not as a method, but as a way of living. It is infused then with a greater sense of moral urgency that manifests itself, among other places, in a certain impatience. Pragmatists celebrate patience, addressing problems one step at a time. Visionaries use phrases like the fierce urgency of now, or why we can't wait, both titles of books by Martin Luther King. The dominant mood of pragmatism is optimism, a confidence grounded in a clear-eyed view of the facts. The dominant mood of the visionary is hope, a faith inspired by seeing more possibilities than the facts themselves reveal. Students attracted to the visionary approach tend to favor figures like Gandhi, Bishop Desmond Tutu, Cesar Chavez, the Vietnamese resistor Thich Nhat Hanh, and feminist activists like Jane Addams and Dorothy Day. Not surprisingly, students attracted to this are interested in issues of transitional justice, like those of the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Interestingly enough, and I'm not going to talk about this in the paper, but I might comment on it afterwards, most of all, American students interested in the visionary approach are interested in criminal justice. And in some ways, I still find this intriguing and a little bit mystifying. The one thing that the visionary students most like about my class is when we visit the Oregon State Penitentiary. And this has made me wonder about why would that particular nexus of concerns be something that intrigues the visionary. And as I said, I'm not going to return to that, but maybe we could talk about that afterwards. Interested in what your views would be. The pragmatist and the visionary sometimes get along, but not always. Things get especially heated around the aforementioned family law issues. Let me explain one. Let me give you the case where we tend to get into this argument. There's a famous case in American law called the Baby M case. It's a case in what's called somewhat misleadingly surrogate motherhood. The facts of the case are this. A couple, wealthy professional couple, wants to have a child, but do not want to have the mother, potential mother has an illness, she doesn't want to get pregnant, okay? So what they do is they enter into a surrogacy contract with a woman, Mrs. Whitehead, who agrees in contractual terms to be impregnated with the sperm of the father, Mr. Stern, and then give birth to the child and then hand the child over for a certain amount of money. You understand what's going on there? So it's someone is having another couple's child and is basically going to give birth to the child for a certain amount of money. What happened in this case was, I think it was about 20 years ago, was that fairly soon before Mrs. Whitehead was going to deliver the child, she decided she didn't want to carry through. She decided that she couldn't give up the child. And so it became a very, very famous case partly because Mrs. Whitehead, when told by the court she had to hand the child over, left her state in New Jersey and fled to Florida. And so there was this kind of, sort of issue crossing state lines and all this stuff. Now, in court, it was decided as a just legal judgment, who's right and who's wrong. I presented to my class as, suppose that you were not in a court, suppose that you were using some sort of conflict resolution, how would you address the problem? The pragmatists immediately sort of say, well, let's look at the particular interests people have and ask what can we most do to get Mrs. Whitehead and the Sterns on the same page? Bring them together as much as possible. The visionaries say, you can't just look at that. You've got class differences here. Mrs. Whitehead is only giving birth to this child because she has no money. The Sterns are this professional yuppie couple. You've got class, you've actually got a racial element, which I won't go into in this class. So the visionaries sort of say, how can you talk about this little bite-sized part of it without getting into these larger issues? You can imagine how the argument goes from there, and it's sometimes pretty heated, all right? Because each side feels the other side is ignoring the crucial issue. Discussions like this can get pretty unpleasant, and when they do, it starts to look like this. To the pragmatist, the visionary concern with changing the context or transforming the world looks like a lot of woo-woo nonsense. I don't know if you have that expression woo-woo in Canada, but it looks like just hot air. It looks like a kind of hot air balloon floating over the real world, inflated with grandiose dreams. To the visionary, the pragmatist preoccupation with what's reasonable given the context looks like a mole-like compromise with things as they are, putting out small fires while ignoring the conflagration all around. Thus described, this difference is not unique to conflict resolution. Pragmatists versus visionaries. In fact, I've now tended to think in some years that I've been thinking about this, you can find it almost anywhere, actually, a disagreement like this. I suspect many of us find variations in our own disciplines. When I first recognized it, it struck me as a variation on a distinction Schiller draws in the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, where Schiller distinguishes what he calls material approaches to things, or pragmatic ones in my parlance, and formal approaches or visionary ones. And in his words, he says the problem is that while one is too much inside things, the other is too much outside things. The pragmatist risks being too much inside, the visionary risks being too much outside. Schiller felt that each by itself is inadequate. I think this is true of the pragmatic and the visionary. In my class, I put it in the pithy phrase, vision without pragmatism is empty, pragmatism without vision is blind. The task then is to reconcile them. But I've actually found this is very, very difficult to do, and in some sense the question of why that is the sort of question I'm going to end the first part of this, okay? It's very difficult to do. Or maybe I've had the wrong picture of reconciliation. Maybe we're visionaries when we're young and pragmatists we're older. Not true in my case, but that might be a way of thinking about it. It's just two temperaments that people have at different times. I'd be interested in what you have to say. My own inclination is to look deeper into the differences, to ask how these differences in what I've called styles reflect differences in political philosophies more generally. If nothing else, maybe this can illuminate why I think conflict resolution is of such great interest to political philosophers. And it may say something about where to go next. So let me just say something about that pragmatic style. I'm going to focus on that, about its background and where it comes from, and how this might help us. My characterization of the pragmatic approach, especially in its privileging of reasonableness, may already have suggested to some its affinities with central trends in political philosophy, starting with John Rawls's political liberalism, continuing through theories of deliberative democracy. All these approaches, Rawls, deliberative democracy, all these approaches, it seems to me, can be seen as enterprises of negotiation and mediation writ large. In Rawls, constitutional essentials are construed as the outcome of a negotiation between persons who are rational in pursuing their own ends and reasonable in their responsiveness to others. The aim of this negotiation is defining the terms of mediation. How should society manage differences that otherwise seem irreconcilable? Deliberative democracy maintains that reasonableness should not just inform the choice of constitutional essentials, it should define the everyday enterprise of democracy itself. These views stand squarely in a much longer tradition of politics and draw force from that fact. Let's call it the civic tradition. This is the tradition that celebrates the institutions and attitudes of civil society, that realm standing between the purely private, like the family, and the purely political, like the state, in which individuals and groups pursue their common interests in the spirit of common deliberation. Since Tocqueville, if not before, civil society has been identified as the sphere of democracy, and today global theorists like Mary Kaldor identify it with the sphere of peace, construct a global civil society. In the United States, what I'm calling pragmatic, civil society, reasonableness, et cetera, in the United States, this orientation actually came into prominence in the 1980s, partly in response to the presidency of Ronald Reagan. The revival of American pragmatism as a philosophical tradition was part of this. Why would it arise as a response to the politics of Reagan? Well, first of all, its equation of democracy with collaborative projects of civil society countered Reagan's equation of democracy with predatory capitalism. But it had the same skepticism of the state. So it shared a kind of a suspicion of the state, but at the same time proposed another way to think about what democracy was. This orientation's equation of peace with expanding the realm of civil society countered Reagan's equation of it with massive military buildups. And finally, I should say, in terms of the revival of pragmatism as a philosophical tradition, Dewey and James, which happened in the 1980s in the United States, I always sort of thought there was a dimension of that of we can be as American as apple pie too, okay? But we just become social democrats instead of conservative Republicans, all right? And we can see why conflict resolution blossomed then, insofar as its critique of legal practices dovetailed with the suspicion of statism. But there's one more element that's crucial. This orientation is deeply secular. In the 1980s United States, this fit with a deep alarm in liberal academic communities over the rise of the religious right. In Rawls and more explicitly in Richard Rorty, liberalism became equated with secularism, or what Rorty terms the de-divinization, taking the divine out of politics. Reasonableness, civility, compromise, all this meant cleansing the political realm of any claim that God is on our side, for therein lay the way to fanaticism. It's not surprising that this coincided with the burgeoning partnership of philosophy departments and law schools, unknown when I was in school. Finally, returning to our chief concern, I think this informs the great attraction of this approach to conflict resolution. Indeed, that attraction is such that for anyone raised in these developments, it may be hard to envision what's possibly wrong with it. Who could be against reasonableness? Who could be against any of those? And I think that within political philosophy, I think that is sort of a huge impulse in this, is it just seems, how can you be against reasonableness, okay? And making that the central virtue. So let me begin with a specific problem with it, and then I'll ask about the larger issue it raises. A striking fact about the pragmatic orientation, especially for an American, is that it has no place for Martin Luther King Jr. or the civil rights movement more generally that he inspired. It's striking because it's paradoxical. Contemporary liberalism, contemporary liberal political philosophy is built on the celebration of the civil rights movement's achievements. The burden of Rawls's theory of justice was to reclaim a rights-based liberalism, but in a way that shed the conservative equations of rights and property rights to construe them instead as civil rights. Yet this political philosophy, I'm suggesting, has no place for the person and movement that brought these ideals to realization. Why not? The problem begins with the fact that King and his movement were deeply religious, to the point of being unintelligible absent that fact. They, like Gandhi, conceived of their movement primarily as a religious one, most evidenced in their commitment to nonviolence as both a political and spiritual tactic. If anyone ever felt that God was on their side, it was Martin Luther King Jr. Why was religion so central? Let me approach with a bit of history. The achievements of the American Civil Rights Movement are so celebrated today that one might think liberals always supported them. In fact, they were quite ambivalent about this, and there's wonderful literature on this that looks at actually how liberal political philosophers and activists responded to the civil rights movement. Total ambivalence, at least for the first 5 to 7 years it was going on. Liberalism was generally sympathetic to the impulses of the civil rights movement, but even here there were disagreements. For example, Hannah Arendt, then a liberal leading intellectual in the 1950s America, Hannah Arendt argued sharply against the mandated desegregation of Brown versus Board of Education, the central Supreme Court case of the civil rights movement. But the main objection of what I'm calling pragmatic liberals expressed their commitment to moderation. Their conviction that, given the context, the demands of the movement, the civil rights movement, were profoundly unreasonable. Better to wait for attitudes to change through education. That was their suggestion. Wait for attitudes to change for education. I would only comment, in the previous century, they hadn't changed as a result of education. It's hard to see how they're going to change as a result of education if aggregation is segregated, okay? But that was very, very much the position of mainstream liberals. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., major political intellectual figure of the time, actually suggested that liberals just stop talking about these issues for 2 years and let things cool down, okay? This was, by the way, the response of similar people to the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, feeling that it was unreasonable, feeling that it was immoderate. The abolitionists were fanatics, they were lunatics, that was the language used. It's also why participants in the civil rights movement, and I have to say, since I came to politics in the civil rights movement, I still carry a little bit of this with me. It's why at the time participants in the movement equated the term liberal with fraud. Not the association people would draw with it today, but in the historical context, that was the concern about it. There are philosophical issues here, but not just ones of personality. Everything about the civil rights movement was unreasonable prior to the civil rights era. America, prior to the civil rights movement, America could not even pass a federal law against lynching. In the 1930s, liberal political majorities were greater than at any time in American history, and in the 1930s there wasn't a single piece of civil rights legislation passed. The country seemed imprisoned in its racial heritage. The last thing in the world anyone expected was a massive social movement in the South driven by young African Americans. Anyone who thinks that the civil rights movement and its developments for African Americans were inevitable should simply ask themselves, why weren't they inevitable for Native Americans? Because nothing about the history of Native Americans in the United States suggests that there was inevitability to them getting full citizenship and their rights. So anyone who sort of thinks, well, it was just history was going to make it happen, I think you have an argument to make there. It didn't make sense in terms of the context, but only for a perspective that looks beyond the context to transform it to what I'm calling a visionary perspective. Now, let me say, Rawls actually has a little bit to address the problem I'm raising, but I won't go into it unless you want to talk about it, is of how does political liberalism deal with the fact that, as I would put it, unless you go outside this perspective, you can never really have any meaningful change. You only have meaningful change by moving from the pragmatic to the visionary. Where is that perspective going to come from, okay? And let me add also parenthetically, I think this problem is written out of history and I think it's been written out of history mainly by American liberal jurisprudence. I think American liberal jurisprudence suggests that the civil rights movement is primarily the result of enlightened federal judges making enlightened federal rulings, and so it was in some sense just a matter of time until the court sort of made enlightened enough rulings that you don't really need a mass movement, okay? Whereas King felt you had to have a mass movement to disrupt the standard assumptions. It has to be a visionary movement, and in his view, it has to be a religious one. How do we reconcile the pragmatic and the visionary? I honestly don't know what the answer to the problem is in this case. On the need for radical ideals necessary to disrupt our received prejudices, Martin Luther King once said, "A sky without stars works fine until it gets dark." Pragmatism is a sky without stars. But I think we're legitimately uncomfortable with views that say the stars as they were must be provided by religion. I think we have good reasons to be uncomfortable with that as well. So let me simply conclude with this problem. It seems as if we need vision as well as pragmatism. I'm not sure how we reconcile the two. And I also think there are real questions about where the vision comes from. And as I said, maybe we can talk about that later on. I pose this as using the phrase, a sky without stars works fine as long as it doesn't get dark, as where do we find the stars problem, okay? Some people would say it's human rights. And so I actually, in a longer version of this, I go into, I think some people would say, well, the guidance today, the ideals, is provided by human rights discourse. And I think that's an interesting suggestion. One of the problems, though, is then they get the same argument of how to construe human rights discourse. Do you construe it in a pragmatic way, as just simply those things that we all tend to agree on now? Or do you construe it as a visionary way of coming from somewhere that can radically upset what we all agree upon now? Okay. Let me turn now to my second topic. So I'm segueing from conflict resolution, some of the issues that arise there, to just war and pacifism. Let me turn to my other topic, just war theory and pacifism. It's probably not too hard to see some connection to what we've just been talking about. Just war thinking has always regarded itself as more pragmatic and seen pacifism as woo-woo nonsense. Another connection, interestingly enough, is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King was both a civil rights leader and, at the time he was assassinated, America's leading pacifist. For him, pacifism meant that war was unconditionally wrong in the way that slavery and later segregation were unconditionally wrong. This, however, turns out to be part of his work that in the United States, at least, is entirely ignored. We just celebrated our national holiday on Monday in honor of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is celebrated in the United States as someone who championed civil rights for African Americans only. That's the way he's construed now. And his entire positions on war and pacifism basically tend to be forgotten, I tend to think, because they don't fit in. They don't strike people as reasonable in the same way that his earlier views don't strike people as reasonable. So for me, it poses the question of whether at some future time we'll regard his commitment to pacifism as every bit as prophetic as his commitment to civil rights. So let me turn now to the disagreement between just war theory and pacifism, and what I'm going to do is move towards putting that in terms of the pragmatic versus visionary. But I'm actually, in the second part, going to suggest that there is a reconciliation on these issues. So I will end on a high note, I think, about, why can't we all live together? Okay. Let me begin with some history about just war thinking. And here, too, as someone who's lived through more of this than a lot of people today, I always kind of think it's sometimes important to go back and tell the history of how we got to where we are, at least in political philosophy, thinking about just war, in part because it will suggest a different perspective maybe on some of the arguments. Now, by just war theory, there's two ways to think of just war theory. One is the principles that apply to combat. Now, just war principles in that sense are the principles that you apply within a war to determine what's permissible and impermissible within the war. But that's a very limited sense of just war thinking, and actually not the one that people would tend to associate with it now. What they would tend to associate with it now is assessing the war as a whole, not just things done within the war, but the war as a whole. Is the war as a whole just or unjust? Okay. And that is the question, the dominant question in today's discourse of just war theory, I think, is the focus of it. How do you assess the justice or injustice of an entire war? Now, let me tell a little bit about the thumbnail, 1066 and all that history of how we got to the present in thinking about this, and then I'll tell you some things about pacifism, okay, and as noted, the visionary and the pragmatic again. The first time someone of my generation, so the generation of the civil rights era in the Vietnam War, the first time I heard of just war theory was in defense of the Vietnam War. It's not surprising in retrospect. Just war theory at one time was a theory primarily developed by Catholic thinkers. and Catholic thinkers were in favor of the Vietnam War on the whole, okay? So interestingly, when I first heard the phrase just war thinking, I was hearing it from people to explain why the Vietnam War was just. Interestingly, the most famous statement of just war thinking of the 1960s was attacking Martin Luther King Jr. And it basically said, we can't have the simple-mindedness of Martin Luther King Jr. because he doesn't even understand the difference between killing in war and murder. Anyone knows the difference between those two things. That's the starting point of just war theory. And so just war theory will help us understand why conflicts like that are permissible. The next step in just war thinking was the appearance of Michael Walzer's book, Just and Unjust Wars, which was in the late 1970s. And when people talk about just war theory now in political philosophy, they have in mind a discussion that begins with Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars. Not the case in my own sense of the tradition, but that's the case I think that people have now. Walzer did two things crucial to understanding where the discourse has been ever since. First of all, Walzer suggested that just war thinking could actually provide a critical perspective on wars, such as the Vietnam War, which he adamantly opposed. The second thing, philosophically, was he suggested that we ground just war theory in notions of individual rights. We make a rights-based theory of just war. Not the way people had thought about just war before. It's not how the Catholic tradition thought about just wars in terms of individual rights. Walzer said, let's ground just war principles in individual rights. His book was actually ignored, though, largely when it came out. I don't think anyone, I think, first of all, people thought he's, sort of talking a lot about Vietnam. This is late 1970s. Interesting to think about that discussion, but it sort of passed us. Actually, for about, I think for more than a decade, no one really paid much attention to the issue. Two things changed the framework about this, in my view. One is an event, and the other is a mindset. The event was the first Gulf War. I think the first Gulf War had a dramatic impact on the revival of just war thinking. Because when America decided that it would expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, very, very much the political rhetoric around that, 1990-91 is when we're talking about, was that this is a just war. It abides by classical just war principles, and that was the way they distinguished it from Vietnam. That was their main burden. How is this not another Vietnam? So just war thinking really came into prominence as a way of defending that military action, the first Gulf War. So that's an event, okay? That's an event which had a dramatic impact. The other was a change in cultural mood. The first one, I think, brought attention to just war thinking. The second, interestingly, brings attention to pacifism and why pacifism is actually now, at least in the circles that I run in, taken more seriously than it used to be, okay? These are changes in mood. Now, I'm talking about the United States. I'd be interested in other people's experiences, but I can tell you how it's worked in the United States. There has been a dramatic change of mood towards war generally. My term for this is, first term is the Great Disillusionment. The simple fact is that war itself is no longer celebrated. And that's a big difference. The term pacifism initially meant simply someone who does not celebrate war. That's what it meant to be a pacifist in the first part of the 20th century. Someone who does not celebrate war the way that, for instance, President Teddy Roosevelt did, of saying that this is how manly virtue demonstrates itself. So at one time, war was celebrated as necessary for manly virtue. War was celebrated as necessary for cultural revival. Have to have a good war once in a while just to keep the spirits up. Teddy Roosevelt twice argued seriously for invading Canada. I don't know if you knew that. And this was a huge, huge issue. But Teddy Roosevelt, the first time he did it, he said, we haven't had a war recently, and so we have to find someone to invade. Why not Canada? It should be part of America anyway. We tried in 1812. We failed then. We can do better now. Okay, it's 100 years later. We're a lot stronger. All right? So interestingly, war was considered a good thing. Didn't matter whether Canada had aggrieved us. Just a good thing to have war once in a while. I don't think anyone but a lunatic thinks that anymore. And that is a huge, huge change. that's a huge cultural change. I call it the Great Disillusionment. It's related to another fact about war, which I'll just mention. I think it's related to the number of fact that people have just started to wonder whether war works at all, whether war is ever the solution to anything, and not just people who call themselves pacifists. An example would be this. Since World War II, America has fought 5 major conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In those conflicts, on the one hand, you have the greatest military power in the history of the earth, the United States, fighting against countries that are economically weak, at most have 1/5 the population of the United States, and relatively resources to resist. Even in those conditions, America has won at most one of those conflicts. Of those 5, you could make a case that America won the first Gulf War. You cannot make a case that it won any of the other wars. They were mainly stalemates, okay, in the case of Korea, or outright losses in the case of Vietnam. The lesson here: war does not work. It's not a good solution, okay, and I'll come back to that issue. The Great Disillusionment. The other thing I'd mention is what I call the Great Defection. Now, this is something that you find in every developed Western country. I'm sure you therefore find it in Canada. You certainly find it in the United States and Europe. The average person doesn't want to participate in war anymore. The average person does not want to fight in a war anymore. When the United States invaded Iraq, something like 65% of the American people supported it. But when asked, would you support the war in Iraq if you had to fight it, support went down to 20%. Here's another statistic that shows the difference in mindset. When I entered college in 1966, the most popular institution in the United States was the draft. The most popular institution in the United States in public polls was conscription, more popular than the post office. Now, if you're in favor of a draft, you cannot get elected dog catcher. Okay, why? Because people seem to still favor war. The average person has absolutely no interest in fighting it themselves. Okay, and this is what gave rise to the discussion, which my last thing was on, what's called the chicken hawk syndrome, of people who are really in favor of war as long as their children don't have to fight it, as long as they don't have to fight it. Okay, I call this the Great Defection. And I should say that American military policy is entirely dictated by this. I read a lot of this, and American military policy is entirely dictated by the fact that they can only generate so many soldiers because the average American does not want to fight it, okay? People who fight our wars come from very specific demographics. Now, I think this has blurred the distinction between just war thinking and pacifism in actually 2 ways. One is, it used to be that someone who favored war favored it because they thought it was basically a good thing in and of itself. I think now people are much more inclined to the pacifist view that war is at best a tragedy. War is at best a catastrophe. The difference is whether they think it's sometimes necessary. So I'll turn to that in a moment. The other difference is this. When I was young, the major difference between being a pacifist and not was whether you would serve your country in war. When I decided at age 17 that I thought I was a pacifist, the first reaction of everyone was, you mean you wouldn't fight in your country's wars? Well, now no one wants to fight in their country's wars, okay? So the difference between a pacifist and a pacifist is no longer would I volunteer immediately to fight in a war. The difference is in some sense become more abstract. In both these senses, I think the difference between pacifism and just war thinking has blurred. It's gotten more problematic. It's one of the reasons why there's more discussion of this. I call this the demarcation problem. What exactly is the difference between being a serious just war thinker and being a pacifist in terms of the views that you arrive at? Okay. So let me turn to where we are today with just war thinking, and then I'll come back to the issue of its difference with pacifism. Contemporary just war thinking is what's generally called revisionist just war thinking. And Francois was telling me that you've had some people like Jeff McMahon and Helen Froh are part of the revisionist tradition. Here's how to think about the revisionist tradition. The revisionist tradition takes seriously the idea that war must answer to individual rights. That's what characterizes a revisionist. War must answer to individual rights. The other thing, interestingly, that characterizes a revisionist is that they're not terrified of pacifism. They're not pacifists. But it used to be that if you said to someone, well, you know, if you believe that, then 4 steps down the road, you might be ended up pacifism. That would be argument for them, don't believe it. Okay? It was a reductio ad absurdum. Whereas today, I think people recognize that if you take individual rights seriously, contrary to Walzer, you may not be able to reconstruct just war principles on their basis. Contrary to Walzer, you either will come up with a just war theory that looks totally different, or you'll come up with conclusions that start to look like pacifism, the view that war is always in some sense wrong. Okay? Now, let me explain first how one type of pacifism has arisen from this, and then I'll explain my own type of pacifism, okay, and then I'll start to wrap it up. The type of pacifism that has most arisen from what I've just described is called contingent pacifism. Contingent pacifism is basically the view that whereas it might be theoretically possible to fight a war that does not violate people's rights, the main concern being the rights of civilians and also the rights of soldiers insofar as they're not really responsible for what they're doing, okay? Contingent pacifism says it might be theoretically possible to fight a war which doesn't have impermissible violations of rights. You may have noticed in the paper this morning that the recent bombings of Mosul against ISIS involved, as all these bombings do, civilian deaths. And the Pentagon announced that they were an acceptable level of deaths. Okay? So they assured everyone that even though they didn't tell them how many deaths it were, the Pentagon felt it was an acceptable level of deaths. Okay? Now, I think contingent pacifism sort of is a reaction against that. It basically says, first of all, what is this acceptable level of rights violations? And if you take that seriously, does it lead to the conclusion that in some sense it's never morally permissible to engage in those type of actions? Okay, that's the contingent pacifist. It's a good position. It's an interesting position. I'm very attracted to it. But let me explain another problem with just war thinking that will wend our way back to the visionary and the pragmatic. It has to do with not how a war was fought, but whether the war should be fought at all. What traditional just war theory says, and what revisionist just war theory also says, is that a war is justified only if it's necessary. Now, that could mean two things. Is a particular battle necessary to winning a conflict? But it also can mean, is the war generally, the war as a whole, necessary? The thing I'm working on now is the fact that there has been remarkably little attention devoted to the issue of what it means to say that a war is necessary. I'm not saying we don't all have a gut feeling about that, what that is, but the challenge for philosophy is to say exactly what it means. Not kind of what it means or for purposes of being reasonable what it means, exactly what it means. It's remarkable how little attention has been devoted to the necessity condition. Attention has been devoted to whether within a war certain actions are necessary, but little attention has been devoted to what it means to say that a war as a whole is necessary. Let me indicate just some of the problems. The necessity of a war is relative to its goals, specifically whether there is any other way to achieve its goals. But answering this means specifying what the goals of a war are. And almost any reflection on real war, actually existing war, shows that it's actually very difficult in any real life situation to say what the goals of a war are. Why is it? Here I turn to the great theorist Clausewitz, who is the greatest friend of pacifism in my view in much of what he says about war. Here's what Clausewitz says. There may be clarity on the negative goals of a war, who we want to defeat. But there is almost never clarity on the positive goals of a war, what we mean to achieve by victory. The kinds of problems that arise here, here are some of the problems that arise. First of all, in terms of what you mean to achieve by victory, there may be conflicting goals. Within a country, for example, the politicians and the military may disagree about what the goal is. That's true of every American war, is that the politicians and the military have actually disagreed about what the ultimate goal of the war was. It was catastrophically the case in the Iraq War. In some sense, the reason the Iraq War worked out the way it did is there simply wasn't any agreement about what the ultimate goal was. Shifting goals. We talk about what the goals of a war are. In most interesting wars, the goals of the war change as the war is fought. There's no more dramatic example of this than the American Civil War. The American Civil War began as a war to keep the South in the Union, had nothing to do with freeing the slaves. And as the war progressed, it was changed from a war in some sense to keep the South in the Union with slavery to a war to abolish slavery. Okay? What were the goals of the American Civil War? Well, now in historical retrospect, I think we tell the story in a way that fits our notion that the war should have been fought. That's an example of historical rewriting, not that different, by the way, in my opinion, what goes on with the civil rights movement. Shifting goals, incomplete goals. Now, let me just say, maybe we could talk about this. We could talk a little bit about the war against ISIS, because I notice that there's now a controversy about whether Canada should participate in the bombing that's going on now in those areas. I think it's a paradigm case of where people can agree on who they want to defeat. Is there really any agreement about what they want to achieve by victory? And of course, the problem is that what we found is if there's no larger vision there, you defeat one person, you just get another person. You defeat Al-Qaeda, you get ISIS. You defeat ISIS, you'll get somebody else, okay? Now, my claim is that this is the nature of war generally. This is my argument with just war theory. My argument with just war theory is that they cannot specify what the aims of wars are in a way that are sufficient to fill out their principles. Because the problems of war's goals are simply too political, that's what Clausewitz said, in some sense, and trying to put it in the kind of precise framework that contemporary just war theory wants to do is simply not going to work. That's not the nature of war. Wars are intrinsically vague, okay? And we have to ask ourselves, is killing people then in their name something that is permissible? Now, let me say though, let me end with returning to the pragmatic and the visionary. I think people are attracted to just war notions because at a certain point they're pragmatists. They simply say at a certain point there's no other alternative. Wars are necessary. Certain point, let's, no matter how much you talk about the facts, at a certain point wars are necessary. Given the context, it's simply unreasonable to think there'll be anything else. Someone like Martin Luther King, a pacifist like me, simply denies that. Simply says that there is no situation in which wars are really necessary. There are always other possibilities. There are always other ways to resolve problems. Now, I don't think those two views can be theoretically reconciled, but I actually think they can find practical common ground. The practical common ground that pacifists and just war theorists can work together on is finding some other way of resolving problems besides violence, besides killing. Working to find other ways to resolve problems so that they could eventually come to agreement that war is not necessary. In that sense, as I said, I'm not sure theoretically the two views can be reconciled, but at least on this one particular case, I think pragmatism and vision can find a common project to work in. And now you've heard why I went into conflict resolution. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's a lot on the table for questions, obviously. So I'm going to be keeping tabs on the speakers list, as it were. I already have a number of questions. So let's start with Professor Farrow, and then if you want to speak, just, and please feel free. It's being recorded, but no one watches these videos. Okay, thank you.
Especially this one.
Is it better to stand? Does it matter?
You can sit down.
As coming at this more from the dispute resolution angle, maybe than from the international, I was interested to and learning from the connections made with people like Fisher and Uri, the getting to yes stuff, which people often, at least on the procedural side, kind of in a not very interesting way, focus on, just a court backlog issue and what have you, whereas I think you nicely brought it back into some normative questions. The question I wanted to ask, though, was about I'm really just interested in how do you use theories that perhaps weren't designed for this purpose, but you want to later on, 25, 30, 50 years later, use them for a different purpose. And I'm wondering about your commentary around Martin Luther King Jr. and the religious motivations. It sounds likely were driving forces behind that, and that's certainly my understanding of it. At this stage, does it matter if we want to deploy those theories for that or other purposes? And sort of refuting the idea that the issues are around the bright stars and maybe, who was it, Coriolanus and Shakespeare, it's really about ourselves, and sort of secularize it and use it anyway.
Well, I think, as I said, first of all, I want to respect that people like King feel that the religious element is crucial to what they see as their politics of, their visionary politics. First of all, that's my own background. But the other thing is that I've had this discussion. I'm good friends with Sister Helen Prejean, who's the woman, the Dead Man Walking. The movie was made about. It's about the death penalty. And we talk about this because she's a Catholic nun. And she would say, you really can't have this kind of not just deeply critical perspective on sort of what most Americans say common sense. You can't have the kind of passion that you need to bring about social change if you don't have something religious going on. As I said, I don't see why that should have to be the case. And also, I don't think I just don't think people are going to buy into it today. Religion is simply to itself contested. But to me, you see, I guess I would simply say that seems to be one of the challenges now, is to sort of explain, well, then what does ground the sort of larger visionary perspective, and also what can ground the kind of political commitment that is needed to realize it, which was actually for King, if anything, more important, is how do you keep people motivated, mobilized, alive, and stuff like that. I think that the discourse of human rights provides some of that, and I said that's then yet another discussion. Because clearly, there's some people who feel that human rights discourses, in some senses, are current utopia, are current stars. But there's other people that are skeptical of human rights discourse as basically accommodationist. And I would say there's also the question about, does it really inspire people? Does it move people in the way you need for social movement? It certainly inspires human rights workers to do it. But if you see real social change as having a more populist dimension or something like that, in America, what mobilizes populism is mainly hatred. That's what mobilizes, talking about that lunch, mainly what organizes people in America most of the time is who do we hate? And so the chance is to find something to mobilize people that is more positive, that is more whatever. And I'm not sure, absent religion, what that looks like. Quite frankly, I'd be interested in what some examples would be, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly historically, religion in the United States, all the progressive movements, in the United States, every progressive movement except for the women's movement has been religiously grounded. It's true of the anti-nuclear movement too. And there's a real question, I think, about what the alternative is. So I guess I'm not answering your question. I'm sort of throwing it back, saying, yeah, that's a problem.
So I have another question here.
All right.
I'm actually really interested in the current American political context and how the two streams sort of interact with what's going on right now. And so I'm wondering, sort of while you were talking, I kept thinking about your soon outgoing president's, I think, efforts over the last 8 years to, I would say, bridge the pragmatic and the visionary approach, especially when it comes to congressional politics and conflict within lawmaking. And I guess I'm wondering if the last 8 years and then the current political context and conflict in America makes you wonder about the usefulness of either of those two paths or of even joining them together. And then on top of that, I guess I wonder about, especially in the congressional political context, the role that outside corporate and financial interests play, and sort of what does conflict resolution mean in either streams when you don't actually really know who's sitting at the table, like when, if that makes any sense.
Now, I think, first of all, your way of characterizing it is, I think, exactly right. Obama's great kind of attraction when he was running for president was to join the visionary and the pragmatic. Obama's visionary discourse is taken almost entirely from Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, his last State of the Union ended with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. So he identifies with that tradition. But at the same time, you know, he wants to be a pragmatist. He wouldn't want to run for president if do it. I have to say, I think the lesson there is these are very difficult things to do together. And I don't think, Obama has, I think, been a very good president, mainly in the things he hasn't done. You know, he hasn't invaded a lot of countries. He hasn't, but he's been barely able to get his medical plan through because of the pragmatics of the opposition he was facing. So I actually think that Obama, unfortunately, is an example of how difficult it really is to join the visionary and the pragmatic. And now what we see now in the American primaries is you have a direct, you have Hillary Clinton being the pragmatist and Bernie Sanders being the visionary. It's almost as if I could have sent them my talk, because Sanders is saying we have to change the context. We have to mobilize millions of people, et cetera, et cetera. And Clinton is saying, well, but it just won't work. Look, we couldn't get the votes for that. How are we going to get the votes for that? See, so, and what we want to basically say there too is, well, why can't we have both together? But again, it seems to be very, very, very difficult to do it. Real fundamental transformation in American politics tends to come about through social movements. It doesn't tend to come about through presidents. Presidents are usually just responding to social movements. Those social movements tend to have sort of a mass base, which is usually grounded in something like religion. Okay, in odd ways, by the way. The second largest reform movement in American history was the Prohibition movement. It was next to the abolitionism the largest social movement in the 19th century to ban alcohol. It was entirely religiously driven. It was hugely popular. You couldn't get elected to anything if you opposed prohibition. So I don't know what that shows you, but it shows you that's where movements come from. The second thing is also a great question, but it's unfortunately so large that I don't know how I would answer it. The difficulty with conflict resolution is like adversarial solutions is who's at the table and who deserves to be at the table. I think when conflict resolution or alternate dispute resolution first arose, it sort of thought we're going to solve all the problems that you have in regular legalistic proceedings. We're just going to find an alternative way. And what you've tended to find is that some of the problems just keep reappearing. Who's at the table? Who has the resources to bring to the table? Stuff like that. So again, unfortunately, that's not an answer that's saying, yes, you're absolutely right. That's an issue for the field. Okay.
All right, thanks for a wonderful talk, and I previewed a bit of this question for you just as we were getting the food, and you were asking for a bit of a Canadian perspective, and no one embeds visionary pragmatism in their DNA like Canadians. So this is very familiar terrain to us. No one has muddled through quite like we have around a range of conflicts. So the area, though, that has galvanized broad consensus in the country, which is not quite addressed yet in the way you've mapped out the just war, is the military conflict for humanitarian reasons. So the failure of Canada to intervene in Rwanda during the slaughter in the mid-90s that Romeo Dallaire has so eloquently spoken of is seen as a pivotal abandonment of an absolutely proper and just mantle to intervene if you can. And
right.
This plays out with the bombing of Auschwitz. It plays out with the Yazidis stuck on the mountain. It plays out in big and small ways in military conflicts and in conflicts that aren't about declarations of war. So and I think it has both religious and secular overtones. It's a broad consensus that any atheist can get behind,
Right.
but also can complicate religious aversion to war when you're seeing suffering that you can change and do nothing. Is that an act of omission or commission? Is a morally and militarily important question. So where does that fit within this interesting array of visionary and pragmatic approaches that you're exposing us to today?
Well, and again, this is also repeating one or two things we said in the break. The issue of humanitarian interventions is actually not something that the pacifist tradition has given much attention to. And I think really the main reason is that throughout history, the notion of humanitarian interventions was 99% of the time just an excuse to carry out major power politics. So that I think that, I mean, and certainly someone like me, raised in the Cold War, carries with them that cynicism about it, that it's really not about humanitarian intervention, about something else. Now, just as I've said, the attitudes towards war have, I think, changed dramatically in the last few decades. To me, the issue of humanitarian intervention really is now one which we need to figure out how to address. Because even though I know that, I think Chomsky, for instance, is quite skeptical of all of this, but I've never been convinced that I'm not sure, first of all, what exactly follows from his skepticism, except let's make sure it's not, a cover for something else.
And clearly it can be a cover
Yeah.
It can be genuine.
Here's how I would put it in terms of how it challenges pacifism. An interesting thing about pacifism is that most pacifists have not been opposed to the police. Most pacifists have sort of thought police forces are fine. They've been skeptical of jails. Quakers have always been skeptical of jails. But interestingly, they're not opposed to the use of domestic force. They just feel that international force has been qualitatively something different. And I tend to think that's true. I mean, if you ask an American, why are we in Afghanistan? What are our goals now? Most people would say, I really don't know what our goals are in Afghanistan. Probably to get out without admitting, that the last 10 years have been a disaster or something. What kind of goal? That's not a goal, that's kind of whatever. So we've kind of gotten used to the idea that when we have wars, the notion that, well, we don't really know what the goals are, we can disagree about them. Unfortunately, we're kind of used to that idea, I think. We don't see how weird it is. But suppose in your own city, you found out, 20 policemen went in and arrested, this group of people in a home, and you ask the authorities, you ask the police department, why did you carry out that arrest, that forcible action? They kind of go, well, we don't really know. There's disagreement about it. Some people say this, some people say that. When we started out the arrest, we thought one thing, now we think another. You would say that's not so. You can't have a police force work that way. So maybe let's agree that the challenge is to reframe the question as, how do we get humanitarian interventions to look more like real police actions and not wars, okay? And there too, I think that's where a pacifist, a traditional sort of pacifist, and a just war theorist could agree. Now, I actually think that it'll look quite different than most of the humanitarian interventions, particularly in their unilateral nature. But I think but you see, it's with humanitarian interventions that I think the pragmatist most presses the pacifist, because I don't think it's enough for the visionary to say, well, we want to change the context. I think the pacifist has to have a real answer to that. So that's why, and that's actually one of the things I work on now, is how do we separate those two out? Because I think that everyone has a sense they're different, but we need to sort of unpack that.
Thank you for a really wonderful lecture. I have lots of questions, but I'll stick to just one. And I'm sorry, I'm going to bump you back down to the kind of domestic. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about how Malcolm X complicates some of the kind of your paradigm or any of the revisionist history around Martin Luther King. There's been quite a bit of work done by social scientists, sociologists on social movements, and the fact that Malcolm X, those two movements provided a necessary tension about which to bring about change.
Yeah. Well, I'm familiar with the view that the notion that a nonviolent movement like King's could succeed. This is what you're saying. A nonviolent movement like that could succeed because of the sense that, well, if it doesn't succeed, the alternative is something like what Malcolm X is proposing. Well, first of all, I'm sure that happens sometimes. I mean, I'm sure that people say, listen, we're using nonviolent tactics here. And if you don't respond to these nonviolent tactics, then you're leaving us no alternative but violence. I ran a seminar actually last year, the first time I've ever done it, on the Israel-Palestine issue. I did it over in England, and it was very interesting to me. It's a hard topic to talk about in the United States. I don't know how it is here, but particularly in academia, it's a very volatile topic. And I remember the issue of the issue of boycotting Israel came up, and whether academics should boycott things in Israel. And one of the Palestinians who was there, I thought, made a very interesting argument. I'm still not sure what I think about it. Look, boycott is a nonviolent tactic. You're telling us we shouldn't use violence, and then you're also telling us now the main nonviolent tactic we have of boycotting, we shouldn't do that either. So what are you leaving us with? I kind of thought that was a good argument. If you're saying you can't engage in these nonviolent tactics, then you'll have violence as an alternative. I should say personally, I don't think that was the case in the American Civil Rights Movement. But that's because I don't think Malcolm X was that big a figure in that era. I think Malcolm X was someone whose star, as it were, loomed much larger after he was dead, and loomed much larger after the main era of the Civil Rights Movement was over, okay? So I think that people now tend to think, well, there was this big issue between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I don't think it was quite the issue when that was going on. In fact, most of the people in King's part of the movement thought that Malcolm X was all talk and no action. I can remember a speech in New York City. I was living then about when Malcolm X was still alive, and one of Martin Luther King's lieutenants was there from the South. And what he said about Malcolm X made a big impression on me, because he said, well, it's easy to talk bad like this if you're living in New York City. Do it in Mississippi, because that's where we are. That's where we're trying to make change. And he was basically kind of saying, you say that this is something that will work, well, then bring it to Mississippi and see how it works. Suggestion being, of course, that it would not get anywhere at all, okay? So I guess the answer is, I do think that that's clearly present sometimes. I just wouldn't read the history of the Civil Rights Movement that way. I don't think King depended on Malcolm X to achieve what he did.
Okay, I have a small point, and then we're going to pass the microphone to Professor Giudice. I just want to push you a bit on your analogy or disanalogy between the war context and the criminal justice context. Mm-hmm. It is true that in the context of criminal justice context, we tend to have reasons that we give for carrying out the kind of police works that we have in our societies, the kind of court systems that we have, the kind of punishments that we have, right? Those are desert, deterrence, sometimes rehabilitation, and so forth.
Right.
Right. But now when you look at what's happening on the ground, right? Who is in the prisons in the US? What kind of population is there? What's happening on the streets, right? In St. Louis, Missouri, in Chicago, in Baltimore, and so forth. It seems to me that if you ask a certain portion of the population, which is quite connected to the one that Martin Luther King was himself connected to, the answer might be quite different, saying, I don't know actually if we need this, right? Or if we need it in this form. At the level of war, we also have these kinds of lofty objectives that we cite, right? Self-defense. Some people will say, well, exporting democracy, stopping oppressions of women in Afghanistan, and it might not be carried out in the way that we aspire for it to be carried out. There might sometimes be even lies that are connected to it, weapons of mass destruction. But it seems to me that that's not so different from what's happening, say, in Chicago, right? When the police carries out operation and we camouflage what they really did for many years because of electoral, sort of maneuvering. I just like to push you a bit on this.
So you're saying I'm insufficiently cynical about
Well, one could be.
something
right?
I'm not
So-
usually accused of, by the way. No, you're right. I mean, I guess in my earlier remark, I was sort of saying, well, we have a notion of what criminal justice should be, that there should be at least some agreement on what we're trying to accomplish here, of a type that I think is rarely, if ever, present in war. But you're right. I mean, someone could say, the way I put it, Francois, restate your point, is criminal justice in America is just another war. It's not something different. So in some sense, we have to reform all of it. I mean, I certainly agree with that. But then, to me, you see that would then say, well, then let's begin talking about what legitimate use of force would be in policing and what legitimate types of goals would be that would be legitimate ones, and then ask how do we really apply that then both to domestic considerations and international ones. The one thing though about the humanitarian actions is, and one reason why it's different is, I actually assume in legitimate humanitarian actions we actually could at least say what we're trying to achieve. If a group is literally, as happened in Iraq, if a group really looks like it's under immediate threat of being decimated as a population, it seems to me we can pretty much agree that our goal is to protect that population. And that's something that Mary Kaldor, you see, someone I follow a lot on this, what Mary Kaldor says is, legitimate humanitarian interventions are solely oriented to protecting innocent people. They're not about realizing freedom. They're not about stuff like that. They're very limited, and because they're limited, we can control them. They don't get out of hand, okay? And I suppose we could say, well, that should be the goal of a domestic system too. It just doesn't seem as if it works out that way as well. Is this an answer?
Oh yeah, the question in front of me, we had a previous Oregon lecturer who's Kit Wellman from Washington University in St. Louis, whose lecture was entitled, Is the American Criminal Justice System a Crime Against Humanity? So it kind of dovetailed into that kind of issue. So Professor Giudice.
Yeah, but Wellman, I think I've heard a version of that lecture.
No, you have.
I don't mean to be pragmatic on him, but what exactly, I actually think, well, first of all, the idea that a lot of what goes on in the criminal justice system is a crime against humanity is already asserted by people. I mean, torture is clearly now, capital punishment is being framed as a problem of torture. Torture is a violation of human rights. I never understood who exactly is going to invade us to defend human rights in America. And it was a theoretical argument, right? Yeah, right, good.
Thanks very much, Professor Ryan. I really enjoyed the lecture, and found very valuable, I should say, the historical context that you provided for some of the philosophical and political ideas.
I'm going to walk over and get a cookie while you're talking.
Sure.
Bring the whole tray to you.
That's fine.
So I found that quite valuable, that sort of correcting, or you might even say desanitizing those historical ideas that, such as civil rights, that have a tendency to become purified in many ways when they're read out of their context. I wondered if I could ask you a philosophical question. So one of the, and you can tell me this is a tu quoque, so you accuse the just war theorists of not having a clear account of what would count as a goal and objective for war. So I'm just curious about what more we could say, or you might want to say, about reconciliation between the pragmatists and the visionaries, and what might count. So what the goalposts might be for trying to reconcile them. Because I'm not quite sure that I understand what that might look like. So one way of putting it, or one way of getting into it, would be to ask, well, just how serious were you when you asked sort of rhetorically, who could be against reasonableness? And one way in which you might think that's true, or there's some truth to that skepticism or that criticism, would be to think maybe of not some of the American pragmatists, but maybe David Hume, who had an interesting idea about the circumstances of justice, right? Justice, of course, it's a virtue, might be a virtue of a particular kind, right, but it's not always and everywhere applicable. There are some circumstances where justice and demands of justice might be out of place. Rawls kind of picks up on that idea as well. So I'm wondering if that's the kind of reconciliation that might be you might have in mind for reasonableness, right? There might be certain circumstances where the reasonableness approach might be the one to go, the one to adopt, but in other circumstances it might not be. And unreasonable and more, not quite sure what the alternative would be, less rational or less responsiveness to others' reasons might be proper. So is that a kind of reconciliation where you kind of relativize whether you're going to adopt a pragmatic approach as opposed to a visionary one by saying, under some circumstances, reasonableness might be the proper approach to go, but maybe not in others. And I should just say, just to sort of cap off the question, Will Kymlicka actually came to this realization when he found that his views on multiculturalism were being exported to places like Eastern Europe. So in his early work, he was sort of explaining and defending the virtues of multiculturalism quite strongly without qualification. His views became quite popular in places such as Eastern Europe, where they had much different results. And he had to come back and say, well, okay, maybe there are circumstances of multiculturalism in stable countries such as Canada. It might be a good political virtue to aspire to, but maybe where there are less civil conditions or less stability, it could be that multiculturalism is not not proper given time and place. So would that be a kind of reconciliation?
It is a kind. If I could sort of restate your view, you might say, let's contextualize the pragmatist versus visionary issue and basically say that depending on the context, one or the other might be appropriate. Is that kind of in the direction you're going? Yeah. I'd still want to then hear a story about how do we know which context is which, because otherwise, if we can't give a story about how we know what the context is one to reconcile them or not, we're kind of back in the same. We haven't really solved the dilemma. We just re-described it. I should say certainly though in our practical lives, I mean, I actually think something like this distinction comes up constantly in different contexts. I think in our practical lives, we tend to do just that. I mean, we tend to look at the context of it. I remember once I was talking to my wife about this, pragmatists versus visionaries, and she said that this comes up in parenting all the time. That was her claim. She had allegations about which one each of us was. I was a more pragmatist, it turned out, and always not holding people to higher ideals and stuff. But I think we kind of agreed, reconciled that by saying, well, it depends a little bit on the issue, the context, whatever. But as I said, in terms of the kind of philosophical issue here, I think we need to say a little bit more about, well, then which contexts work for which purposes, okay? Let me just add a note. I didn't get into this, but the claim that war aims are too vague is actually, I think that's something you find in the pacifist tradition, is the whole idea of war aims are too vague. You don't just find it in the pacifist tradition. In the United States, in the history of the United States, and in the US Constitution, there was the notion that a war had to have a declaration. And in fact, the US Constitution says that the country cannot go to war without a formal declaration of war. Now, what is a declaration of war? Well, if you look at the debates at the time, what people said is that a country has to state what it's trying to achieve by a war. Because if you don't do that, a republic doesn't do that, you're going to get the British Empire meandering around the world without any explanation of what it's doing. So they actually thought that the essence of a republic was that it explained to people exactly what we're trying to achieve here, because only then can you ask people to fight and die for it. They said it's ridiculous to ask people to fight and die if you're not even telling them the reasons for doing it, okay? So I actually think that my view returns much more, you see, to the original constitutional principle, which, as we know, has been totally forgotten about for the last 70 years. The idea that they're declarations of war, the idea they're clear statements about what the goals are, has been completely forgotten about. If I were urging that we have some kind of legitimate war-making mechanism, I would begin by saying a country has to state exactly what it's trying to achieve. And by the way, if it meanders away from that, the war should then stop and have to be reaffirmed or something like that. Okay.
If you can just pass the microphone one now.
I wanted to pick up on the comment that you made during your conversation, and it started to come up a little bit in the question and answer period about the criminal justice system, and you had expressed a bit of interest in the fact that, I guess, the visionary interest in criminal justice. Just because from my perspective, I'm very much a proponent of human rights. And for me, human rights are completely tied up with the criminal justice system. And you mentioned about the war, and especially in the US, where there's business interests tied up with the prison systems. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, let me tell you what actually a more specific thing that has intrigued me. And maybe you can tell me what the explanation of it is. I understand that American criminal justice poses terrible human rights problems. So it doesn't make any sense. It makes perfect sense to me that someone concerned with human rights and with notions of larger justice would be very, very upset about the criminal justice system for the reasons that Francois was talking about. I get that. What's been intriguing to me, though, is in some sense an experience. Okay, and the experience is this. We go to the Oregon State Penitentiary. Every term I do this, every fall. And we visit the death chamber, the execution chamber. Now, this is a very distressing experience. First of all, because even though they haven't executed anyone in Oregon for some years, it's just suspended, it's not been abolished. And so it's not the case that it's just a relic. The other thing is the experience of going into a death chamber. I don't know if people have had that experience. The main thing, it's not like, it's worse than the movies. It's worse than the movies, that's all I can say. Mainly, it's incredibly small. I had no sense of this, but where they strap you down to be executed is about 4 feet away from where the person is who executes you. They're right there, they're right next to you and giving you a lethal injection. Also, in the state of Oregon, you're under, for 3 days before you're executed, you're under 24-hour surveillance. You're in a room under 24-hour surveillance. That room is 10 feet away from where you're executed. All of these rooms are the size of bathroom stalls because it used to be a men's urinal. That's where the execution chamber is. It's a converted men's urinal, so that the rooms are former bathroom stalls, okay? And finally, there's no one else in the death chamber. It's too small to get anyone in there other than the students, but you can hear the people on death row screaming, because that seems what goes on 24 hours a day on death row is people screaming, or at least when anyone is present. This turns people into visionaries. And there's a part of that that I still don't understand, quite frankly. I mean, because I would think it could have just the opposite effect of, look at what human beings do to each other, you know? It could have the effect that like the Holocaust had on some people of, you know, well then anything we could do to kind of make life marginally better is what we should try to, because people are such terrible people. But to a person, this experience seems to have that kind of a visionary impact. And I'm not sure I understand it. I mean, if someone's already committed to human rights, I can see why it would make them committed to human rights and criminal justice. I can't see how it would have that impact to sort of make people that way generally. And I would say, then I noticed, that reflecting on this, of how many pieces of the literature in the visionary tradition are jail stories. One is the autobiography of Malcolm X. Martin Luther King's most famous writing is Letter from a Birmingham Jail. The greatest text of the 19th century on the visionary tradition is Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, describing a night in jail. So there's something about that experience that connects the two. And that's partly what I said. I remain kind of intrigued by that because I don't quite get it. But I can tell you that that's what it does to people. It's interesting. The pragmatists come, you know, if someone's already pragmatically inclined, they come away sort of thinking, well, we have to, you know, tinker with this and tinker with that. And most people come out of it the way Thoreau does in his essay of The World Just Looks Different to Me Now. And that's the part of it, you see, that intrigues me now. I don't quite understand.
We have time for one last question, and it'll be yours.
So my question relates to conflict resolution and pacifism
Right.
as they relate to the current security situation in the South China Sea. So the American government has been running freedom of navigation missions And I wanted to get your opinion on whether you thought this was an appropriate response to resolving conflict and what would be a pacifist response. And secondly, Beijing seems to really be pushing for bilateral negotiations and not multilateral negotiations. And I'm wondering if you have any insights on how we could approach resolving the conflict in that way.
You know, I really don't. On a pragmatic level, I don't think I have any way to comment on that because, I mean, I'm aware of the situation. I would say, though, what worries me is that at least since 1998, official American military policy has been that China is the next great enemy. You know, one of the problems with saying that war is theoretically possible and these things are possible is that you end up therefore preparing for them. And then once you start preparing for them, they don't just become possible, they become inevitable. And that's something that, I mean, only someone like me who studies a lot of military policy, I think as an American, is fully aware of that. But I'm very worried about all of that, quite frankly. It really does seem as if there's a sense in which who will be our next enemy is behind a lot of that stuff in South Asia. That's my sense of it. You know?
Well, let me intervene. What could go on, I'm sure, much longer, Cheney, because the issues you've raised are provocative and profound and pragmatic all at once. And it's wonderful to see the different dimensions of our thinking and our work engaging with yours. And that's exactly what the point of this lecture series is about. And there's a sense of genuineness in this time of year in Canada, because we know whoever comes to Toronto in January is not coming for the glamour, not coming for the glory, is coming because they truly want to be a part of our discussions and are responding to the invitation that we want to engage with theirs. So there's always something of a warmth that comes from these crisp days and these talks, which so animate this time of the year, and this was no exception. So let me do two things. One is to make sure you leave with some swag and some tokens of our appreciation from Osgood and the Nathanson Center, the Winkler Institute, the whole Osgood community, with which you've got lots of points of intersection. And join me in, ask everyone, I should say, to join me in thanking you for a wonderfully stimulating talk.